Welcome back to the channel. Now that the long side rocker repair is complete, we must epoxy prime the side of the bus in order to prevent any further rusting while we continue to work on her. But before we can do that, we must deal with the body seams, and for that we'll be using bare metal seam sealer. If you're interested in this type of restoration content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel as there are new episodes every Sunday and Wednesday. For now, let's get right into the work. Now there are many kinds of seam sealer to choose from. There are 1K sealers that come in a regular caulking tube, and 2K seam sealers that are essentially a two-part epoxy. There are also brushable seam sealers, but I don't have any on hand to show you. But in this application, I will be using a 2K bare metal seam sealer, and I will get into why shortly. Now, unfortunately, in order to use a two-part seam sealer, you need this overly priced applicator, but it's the same one I use for panel bond, and you all know I love that stuff. The reason I'm resealing these seams is that due to the fact that this bus was never maintained well, the original sealer has begun to crack and has failed in many places. This has caused the seams to rust. I've seen people simply sand down their bus and paint over the seams without digging out the old seam sealer and replacing it, and let me tell you, your paint will crack at the seams sooner rather than later, and it's going to ruin your paint job. I'm opting to use bare metal seam sealer rather than seam sealer over epoxy because of the fact that even though I have wire wheeled and sprayed OSPO in my seams, there still might be rust pitting in there, and epoxy primer tends to fail when sprayed over rust pits. My thought process is that bare metal seam sealer will do a better job at adhering to my prep metal and sealing away any pits from further oxygen reaching them and causing further rust. Prepping the seams for seam sealer is certainly the most tedious part of the process. I found that using these small Dremel wire wheels were the most effective way at removing the old sealer. Once I removed as much sealer as I possibly could, I sprayed OSPO in the seams and let it sit for a while. I then went over the seams with the wire wheel once more. It's impossible to get all the rust out of the seams without having your bus dipped or maybe having it soda blasted, but using the OSPO we can ensure that as much of the rust as possible is neutralized. Because this is a 2K seam sealer, it has a much quicker dry time and paint window. This is why it's important to read your technical data sheet before using any product. Here we can see our work time is 10 minutes, the mixed nozzle dwell time, and the amount of time I guess you could just have it sitting in the nozzle, 6 minutes, and the cure time is 1 hour. Now the paint time it says 15 minutes, but I won't be painting it that soon. Now if we scroll down a bit and look here, we'll see if the sealer is allowed to cure more than 24 hours, scuff the sealer prior to any painting steps. Now this is important because you want to ensure that you paint over your seam sealer before its window of chemical adhesion has closed. Due to the fact that I will be epoxy priming this panel shortly after the sealer is applied, it is important to ensure that the surface is already prepped for the epoxy primer. This means ensuring there is no surface rust on the panel. I did this by spending a couple hours with the wire wheel and OSPO, making sure that all the spots where the paint had chipped and rusted down to the bare metal were rust free and all the way down to the deepest pit. The next step is ensuring your surface has the proper bite for adhesion. I did this by sanding it down with my orbital sander and a 40 grit sandpaper. Make sure to also sand the metal in the areas that the sander might not be able to reach. And once everything is sanded, we can follow the usual procedure for cleaning the metal surface. But before we got to cleaning the surface, I wanted to ensure that no paint was oversprayed to the inside of the bus as it is not prepped for epoxy primer yet. So I had Mallory come help me out with masking it due to the fact that this is one of my least favorite parts of painting is masking. And well, it turns out that Mallory is really bad at masking as well. But we did our best and we kind of got it done. Thankfully, this isn't for beauty points. This is only in order to allow no paint to kind of fly into the inside of the bus. I like to ensure that my area is dust free, so I'll use the blower and blow as much dust out of my garage as possible. I then like to use a blower to blow off my surface. This is to ensure that there is no dust or leftover sandpaper on it. We'll follow that with acetone. Make sure you don't use a rag with dye. Window cleaner. And then we will follow that with wax and grease remover as the last step. With the surface clean and ready for epoxy, we can get to masking the seams. This is to ensure that we don't get seam sealer everywhere as this stuff is sticky, and we will be removing it before the seam sealer completely dries. I tried a few different techniques to ensure that I pushed as much seam sealer into the seams as possible, and then also my camera died here. But essentially, I'm just laying a nice bead of seam sealer and then using my finger with a glove to push it deep into the seam. Once it's smoothed out, I can go ahead and remove the tape and let it cure for about an hour. Before I got to epoxy priming, I wanted to ensure that this area here that I had repaired and used POR 15 over was ready for the epoxy primer to be sprayed over it. For that I used the POR 15 self-etching primer. I masked off just the area where the POR 15 is at, and then, as per the instructions on the can, I gave it 2 light coats of POR 15 self-etching primer. Let that dry for 30 minutes and then we're just about ready to move on to the last step. Since we taped the surface and possibly contaminated it, we'll go over it one more time with the wax and grease remover to ensure the optimal surface for adhesion. I've sprayed all of the epoxy primer on this bus so far with the Harbor Freight HVLP gun, and to be honest, with a decent pressure regulator, it does a good job. I'm using the 1.7 tip here, and I'm just doing my best to keep a consistent motion and not lay it on too thick. Once I had a nice even coat, I let it dry for about 30 minutes and then gave it one more light coat. And will you look at that? Just look at it.
Gosh, just look at it.
The car is not perfect.
One more section of the bus is sealed and looking beautiful. Now we'll need some more work. We are going to have to use some fiber reinforced filler here and there to get things to smooth out completely, but unfortunately we are running out of time in this episode. So don't forget to leave a comment and I'll see you in the next one.